بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Hello everybody and welcome back to Connections. We're on episode 8 and we are here again with Sheikh Idris. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Idris. Thanks for joining us again. It's always a pleasure. Alhamdulillah. So we are here, episode 8, like I mentioned, but we're in part 3 of a mini-series that we've been doing for the past 2 episodes on the ruh, jism, and nafs, or the body, soul, spirit, or the body, mind, spirit. And we've been exploring in the past 2 episodes on the nature of the nafs, the self, if you will, and the nature of the qalb, which is the heart. And we've been talking about how those 2 things have an embodied reality. They have a relational dynamic and apparatus attached to them as well. We talked about in the last episode the wider conception of the mind. What is the mind? Is it just this abstract, transcendent almost type of faculty of thinking, or is it something else that's more connected to the emotions, more connected to the rest of the body? Is it connected with this felt sense? We talk about this felt sense, the emotions and the physical sensations of the body. And so we talked about that, inshallah ta'ala. And today we will be working, or exploring rather, the third aspect of the ruh, which is, you can translate it as the spirit. Again, all these kind of concepts really overlap quite a bit. So we're kind of giving these arbitrary definitions, but just a working kind of idea. The ruh is the spirit. And one thing I'm really actually interested in this conversation specifically, because, the Hakims and even Imam Ghazali in the Ihya, he talks about the 2 aspects of the ruh. One being this more transcendent capacity of the soul to know and to perceive, and it being kind of this rendering of the heart, this deeper rendering of the spiritual heart. But then there's also, he talks about, which is where I'm again really interested in, the vital subtle body that informs the life force in the body. Imam Ghazali talks about how this is the subtle vaporous type of energy that flows in the arteries and the chambers of the heart, that flows in the arteries of the body, that informs sensation, that informs physiology, that informs the emotions. It is the very life principle. And I often help people try to understand this by telling people, when we talk about, for example, homeopathy or hydrotherapy, or even the vital force and somatic counseling, talk about the energy, where's the energy stuck? And people are like, what do you mean energy? This is sounding really woo-woo. And I tell them, it's not woo-woo. You believe in the ruh, aren't you? You're a Muslim. You believe in the ruh. And so really quite simply, it's like when the angel of death comes and takes the soul of the human being, and right before that moment, there was all this physiology happening. There was just an entire apparatus of feeling, of motion, of circulation, of digestion, of assimilation, of elimination, of cognition, of perception. What was just in there before the angel of death took the ruh that was giving life, and then after the ruh was taken out, the body collapses into a mound of clay. That was the life force. That was the spirit. And so part and parcel of good medicine, I truly believe, is a appreciation of the centrality of this vital force, of the workings, of the patterning, of the engagement of the life force in the organism, and the way that it moves, and the way that it gets stuck, and the way that we can begin to employ it for healing and growth and transformation. All these things are super important. And so this is where I'm very interested in. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this, Sheikh Idris, because, at the end of the day, this is really what we're talking about when we talk about healing. We're talking about restoring vitality, restoring health and well-being, coming back to our fitrah, coming back to health. Health is our default. Well-being is our default state. Given perfect conditions, we should be able to all have our range of motion physically, our sense of feeling, our range of expression, our modalities of, free will being able to be employed, our creativity, all of that, our strength, our willpower, all of that should be there. And so when things are not there, how can we begin to return that? And that being a function, something of an imperative of our deen, this is really, really important. So I'm really excited about today's session. So maybe we can begin to frame it. Sidi, how would you begin to frame this concept of the ruh, kind of a tail end of working with the nafs and the qalb? What is the ruh? How do you differentiate it from the previous two things we've been talking about? And yeah, how do you build upon it?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's difficult sometimes to differentiate because these are overlapping terms, and we've got to, I think that's one of the most fundamental things we appreciate when we're studying this map of the psyche from an Islamic perspective, is that these are overlapping things that blend in with one another and often share qualities. So like you're saying, I mean, as Imam Ghazali mentions in the chapter on Ajab al-Qalb, the wonders of the heart, he does make this distinction between the two types of ruh we're talking about, the ruh al-hayawani, the sort of basic primary energy that gives us that tells us we're alive. And you've already mentioned that. And, we sort of alluded to that even in the nafs. One aspect of the nafs is it's about flow coming in. And it's sort of something entering into something like a thinner channel, almost as it permeates it and it's flowing through it. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the ruh al-hayawani. It's that life force, which could be we could be referring to the nafs there, but focusing on a very specific aspect of the nafs in terms of it is what gives us life, and it's that flow. That's number one. Number two, then, because all animals share that quality, all life shares that quality. That it has, anything that's animated has that energy. But then obviously we have another aspect of the ruh in terms of human beings, and it's that life force can tap into something far larger than itself. And I think that's the distinction between the nafs, when we're looking from the nafs from the perspective of its flow and life energy. It's almost something almost restricted to some sense, it's within something flowing, whilst the ruh is about expanding out. And so when we look at it from an etymological perspective, the word ruh comes from flow. It means to spread out. It means to be gentle and subtle and expansive. So when we look at that, it's got a distinct quality in that it's almost expansive, and it's reaching out to something larger than itself. It's craving to connect to something larger, whilst the life force is, to some degree, the life force wants to assert itself in the world, but it's to some degree, my understanding is that it's limited within the vessel, whilst the ruh is something, it's much more, I don't know if is it effervescent, the word, but it's much more sort of subtle and much more.
Yeah. It has a reach where I feel like in the more corporeal kind of aspect, it's more just self-organizing. It's kind of just defining the contours of this haywan, this living thing. And then there's that more deeper aspect that says, great, that's there. Now,
it's
what
a survival energy, like you're saying. It enables us to function in the world and achieve what we need to achieve to be to assert ourselves from a perspective of survival, whether that's survival of ourselves or for survival of the group or whatever. The ruh is something very different in quality there. It's not focused on survival from that aspect. It's actually focused on thriving beyond survival to connect to something far larger than itself, its ultimate source. And it's so almost difficult to really grasp, because it's the words that come from it. It's like perfume. You smell it, it's there, but you can't detect its body. And you can't even detect its direction sometimes, like the wind, and the wind is another word that comes from this root. Rawah means to mean almost, you know, you're going, there's relaxation, and there's almost, you feel like you've got expansion and flow.
Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when people are
So,
dancing, even, I mean, I get that when even as you were doing that, just people just dancing and flowing. And I mean, these are things that I kind of shifting gears a little bit, but, you know, these are things that we can do
yeah,
with one another to help, you know, bring that kind of flow state in, because all of nature you find is expressing rawah.
mm,
There's a type of flowingness and easiness, a sense of being, a sense of going into something. It's not stagnating and ever,
yeah.
you know, even the mountains are moving, you know, everything is moving in its own pace by its own nature. And so when you did that, I just remind, you know, there is a type of flowingness. We have to be able to allow ourselves this thing. And, you know, the more that we are able to connect with that within us, the more that we can be able to share that with one
Well,
another.
dance, if you look at dance, there's almost a craving to be interconnection and rhythm with something else.
Totally.
And the Ruh has that quality, is it's craving to be in rhythm with its ultimate maker. And so what you've touched upon there, and what we've been exploring, is that's very much in this world still. It's our experience of the other. And so, but when we're speaking from an Islamic perspective, from a spiritual, like a religious perspective, we're speaking about the connection to the ultimate, really, and, you know, really being able to get outside of ourselves. And so, but all of these, you know, as I said, they all overlap with one another, and they're all interconnected and relate to one another. It's like the higher sphere
Mm-hmm.
of all these things we've been exploring, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost the seat for the qalb. It's like it's feeding the qalb. The qalb, we said, is the capacity for us to really grab things and almost work with them, almost be able to analyze them, understand them, and then work with them. But the ruh is really feeding the heart about what it's, you know, what it's craving, and giving it that sense of what it needs to connect to ultimately, which is its maker.
Yeah.
Whilst
So
the ruh al-hayawani is craving that connection to the material needs, like the relational piece to other human beings and things and ourselves, and it's got a very different, so its functioning is quite similar, but its focus is in the world. And so, like we said last week, the qalb is trying to integrate the aspects of the nafs. And when we're talking about the life force, we are speaking about the nafs there. And then we've got to then integrate that, like Hakim always goes on about, talking about samawati wal ard, you know, the heavens and the earth. We need to be rooted in the earth. And then, but then at some point, we need to be able to transcend beyond that, whilst being rooted at the same time, the transcendent inclusion.
Mm-hmm. The image of the tree, the image of the goodly tree that's rooted in the earth and extending to the heavens. Yeah. And so this is what really makes up the human being. You know, it's like we cannot limit any of these aspects, any of these faculties from our experience, from our growth process. All of these things are necessary for us individually and collectively. And we find that, you know, in some way, you know, I know we've been talking, we maybe touched upon this in the first few sessions, but the idea of really going too quickly then maybe, because
this is important,
too
this point,
quickly without having that self-organizing safety container of the ruh first, to allow that kind of later transcendent capacity.
We need a sense of our life energy. We need a sense of our self before we start transcending.
Yeah, exactly.
Because what's going to happen is everyone has an experience of loss of self. The ruh is basically loss of self to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Because what is loss of self? It's where basically you're losing control. And when you lose control, are you able to do that in a healthy way where you can let go and almost feel safe to do that? Or at least give yourself the reassurance, if things will be okay, I know I've got something to come back to. And we can experience that on a very simple level of, like, you know, you lose your job, and then you feel this loss of self because you identified with your job. And now what's going on? Now, some people could literally go into a state of psychosis. You know, they could literally completely fall apart and lose their sense of self. And so this is what's so important. The difference between enlightenment and psychosis is that you know how to come back. because and you've got a grounded nafs that went through the stages of development, understands those experienced those stages of development, and they've also got a paradigm, like a reference point for life. That's why tradition is so important. If you don't have that, and then something happens where you have a shattering of the self, which is a ruhi experience, because the ruh is beyond the self to some degree. This is why we're suffering from, psychosis is so deadly in a secular society, because we just don't know how to deal with it, because it's all about keeping yourself together no matter what. And that's not possible. You will have moments in your life when you have complete loss of self. And so how do we deal with that? And so, this is what the ruh is, almost you lose that sense of self. But because we have a religious paradigm to work from, that there's a reassurance that we can come back, and we have a community that understand the tradition. Hopefully we have people grounded in tradition, that we've inherited practices to help people come back and find themselves after that. So this is what we're dealing with, and this is fundamental. This is like a really important concept. This, when we live in a time of loss of sense making, because that's natural. We can go into a state of loss of sense making where we almost have to let go of our paradigms. But there's got to be something to come back to, and this we live in a society that didn't have something to really a sort of a rooted framework to start off with in the first place.
Yeah. So again, it's like we're always coming back to a process, and that there is like a stepwise kind of gradual growth that needs to be there. And so even in these higher realities of things that are, and things were there before we even existed, we have to be able to contain them in a certain way that's healthy, that's not overwhelming, that we can come back to kind of our humanity after experiencing this loss of self. And that's actually a higher mode of being in the world. It's that higher, safer, and more mature, I would offer. And I would maybe even say more Muhammadan.
Well, it's the baqa. It's what we call baqa,
yeah,
from a spiritual perspective. It's subsistence, coming back from the fana, the annihilation. And people say, what are these terms? These are all high. But they're real. Because someone says to me, I want to experience fana. I want to be annihilation of the self. And I say, you do it every night. You go to bed. And you go into a delta state.
Yeah.
And this is really important. Now they're using, I really like this framework. I find it very helpful to frame things, is that they talk about, beta and alpha and theta and delta, these states. And what's so interesting is the beta state is mulk. It's like you're in the world. And the beta state is basically the fastest pattern. You'll see it moving like this. It's almost you're engaged in the objective world, and you're almost pulled by it, and you're working with it. So it's quite a frantic state where you're engaged. And then we move into alpha state, where the hertz per second, they come down and they slow down. Is that what we're in now? We're in a more introspective state where we can actually learn. We're more perceptive. We're more open and more perceptive to something other than ourselves. Then we move into theta state, and theta state is that liminal now. This is where there's an element of loss of self to some degree, where you're letting go to your sense of self. And we experience that when we're feeling a bit tired and we're drifting into bed. We almost feel like our sense of self is a little bit, and that is a mode, that state of being at that point is where we're touching into the liminal space, and we're able to allow something in. So I've heard, I don't know whether this is true, but I read that at Einstein, when he was really struggling with a concept he was working with, he used to sit in a chair and have something like some ball bearings or something in his hand, and he would go into this theta state, this almost where your sense of self starts to almost open up to something bigger, and he'd have the ball bearings in his hand so he wouldn't fall asleep. He wanted to, because he'd have these concepts, then go into this state, and usually he'd have inspiration. And that's REMs. That's REM as well, because we've still got a sense of self, because when you're in REM sleep, you're seeing things, you're dreaming. So you've still got a sense of self there. And then we've got deep sleep, which is delta, which you've got complete loss of self completely. You're in fana. I says, so you're experiencing fana every night. You know?
So you wake up, literally, you're the higher maqam.
Well, yeah, and what you said is that because, well, what's so important there, I was reading excerpts from a book recently on sleep, the wisdom of sleep. And he was saying that one of the wisdoms they think, and what's so amazing about sleep and dreaming, we don't really know, you know, because it's dealing with a realm that we'll never be able to really quantify and get to the bottom of it. But one theory was, which I liked, was it's emotional processing when we go to REM sleep. So people who have had some sort of emotion, some emotional turmoil in the day, they found with subjects, people like with people they were experimenting with, that people who were able to go into REM sleep, they woke up and they're emotionally a lot better, in a better place. People who can't get in REM sleep, that like disturbed sleep, it's constantly being disturbed, they can't emotionally process things, and so they stay in their agitated state. So actually we need to go into that sort of some sense of loss of self, so like a loosening of the self, in order for us to let go. And so we're experiencing, these are states where, you know, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, we're going through these things constantly. But the thing is, I love that C.S. Lewis quote. He says, what we learn from experience depends very much on the philosophy we bring to the experience, though. And that's, you know, as Muslims, we need a cosmological framework to understand. And that's what we're doing here. We're understanding, you know, this. Anyone that wants to go into psychology, anyone wants to go into spirituality, has to understand their framework of what's working here. And so these videos are fundamental for people to really understand, you know, these concepts we're sort of musing over and really trying to understand. This is fundamental stuff. And Imam Ghazali mentions that. He says so many scholars didn't really grasp these concepts. And I think the more we sort of sit with them and almost sort of meditate over them, the deeper understanding we get from them.
Inshallah, that's my intention with this as well.
So we do another year. We repeat them in a year's time. We'll probably see them from a very different perspective.
Yeah, inshallah, that'd be great to do kind of part 2.0, connections 2.0 at some point once we finish these. And continue to refine these, because these are so important, you know. And when you were speaking, this liminal space, the barzakh, I think, is what we say really the dream world is. And it's like this interspace. And so I had this kind of connection where when you said the sleep is where we process our emotions, and the heart is the kind of locus of emotions. The heart is that interspace between the nafs and the ruh, kind of this center place that kind of reaches up and roots down. And so in that kind of capacity, when you sleep, you allow the heart to open. There's an opening of the heart. And that's a great, I mean, we can do that even with one another. You know, I think that in intimate encounters that the heart can open as well, but it's like this inbuilt rahmah where we can actually go and surrender to Allah Ta'ala, and that being a process that we can go into and open up our hearts and process that. That's really beautiful. And what you find now in the modern world is people don't really sleep. They're staying up late.
Yeah. They don't dream as well.
And they don't dream. And they don't enter into delta, never mind delta, REM or delta. And so they're waking up unrefreshed. They're tired throughout the day. They're drinking coffee. They're burning out their circuits, you know, with Red Bulls and caffeine and whatnot, and pushing themselves and furthering that connection to their hearts. Really, I mean, all of these lifestyle rhythms in some way are there to foster that deeper connection to our heart. And this is one of the really deeper elements of the Sunnah, is the lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ. It's not there just this, romantic or just cute kind of, the Prophet ﷺ ate with his right and he didn't drink and he would sip this way. I mean, these are elements of trying to perfect the human constitution. This is the way to do that. This is very deep. And so when the Prophet ﷺ would sleep early and would rise midday, in the middle of the night, he's expressing really the ideal for the human nature and how to optimize its physical well-being as well as the spiritual well-being, the capacity for the heart to find its rendering, its balance, and for the ruh to be able to reach upwards and find what it's longing for.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, this is a slight distinction, I think, between us. One reflection here is, you know, in more Buddhist, more meditative practices rooted in Buddhism, there's this idea of being connected to being. Who am I? And seeing yourself as an object, and then seeing yourself as a subject, and who is the subject?
Mm.
You know, and that's what they call, you know, Ken Wilber's got this meditation called the Big Mind, he calls it, where it's like, who am I? But fundamentally, as Muslims, we go higher than that, because there's that loss of self, and then connecting to being of Allah, and we are the object. You know, we say in Western, where they say all this is subjective. From a traditional point of view, our inner experience is not it is subjective in relation to the objective world, but it's the object of the ultimate subjective. And so even the subjective experience is objective when it's in relationship to an ultimate witnesser. And our ruh is that almost it refracts, so it can connect to that. So when we do meditative practices, we're looking at it from a very different perspective. It's important that we understand that. That ultimately we have to have an understanding of who that witnesser is. Whilst in a lot of alternative spaces, there's not some cosmological framework for that, really. And if there is, it's very much rooted in more Eastern Buddhist or Hindu perceptions of that.
Yeah, so not a personal God or anything like that, but just some supreme mind. But
or the creation, or the creation, and we're part of that, and so forth.
The ever-listing.
So I've got no issue with the practice. What's more interesting to me is what we're sitting, you know, our understanding of this thing.
The
and like we were saying, the
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis quote is that your experience is very much dependent on what the philosophy you bring to it.
Exactly.
But that being exercise is so important. Can you almost be, what is that sense of being of yourself? And then what's that sense of looking down on that? This is the ruh we're working with now.
Yes.
And then can we have our sense of the ruh being held by ultimately the witnesser, the ultimate witnesser, and the ultimate first person? That's about, you know, I invite people in their meditative practices to bring that in.
Dan Siegel has one just similar to that, but he stops at, you know, the wheel of awareness. He stops it. Same thing. They all stop at the same place, where it's like,
well,
you
Charles
can become
Upton
aware.
says that. Yeah, he says, Charles Upton makes a very good point. He says Buddhism is its excellence is in immanence. It doesn't have transcendence ultimately. And that's one. We need that. There's one step of that, but it's got to transcend above that, and that's you know.
So in some ways, like the hadith of Jibril on ihsan, where it's like muraqaba, it's like, you know, being able to this witnessing, being able to witness up, also receive that witness from Allah Ta'ala, you know. And I think that we start that process by becoming aware of ourselves first. When that yin yang dynamic, when, you know, yang is kind of the witnessing, the witnesser, and the yin is the receiving. Well, if that's the case in that cosmic hierarchy, then in some way you have to play the role of yang and witness the body, witness the sensations, witness the emotions, witness your thoughts. Just be with them and say, wow, me being aware of my body tells me I'm not my body. Being aware of my emotions tells me I am not my emotions, though they're my emotions and they're very much real, but I have them. But there's a type of separation there as well, which is to be respected. I have these thoughts, but I'm aware that I'm thinking, so I'm not these thoughts. So who am I? And so these people, Wilbur and Siegel, will say, well, you're the I, that big I, that witness, that's you. But then we go and say, but la ilaha illallah.
There's something beyond that, you know.
La ilaha illallah.
Yeah. And they speak to some truth, but we take it one step higher. But again, what's the important caveat that comes up for me constantly with this work, the problem with the meditative work is it can become disassociative if it's not rooted. And we see that in spirituality is almost, there's, you know, there's a subtle distinction between disassociation and an actual spiritual experience. They're very much interconnected to some degree, because there is an element of you almost rising above yourself, but that we have to have a sense of self that we can come back to. in order to have a real integrative and more holistic and nourishing experience of transcendence.
That's
And
which is the human experience.
Yeah.
Which is a full human, which is what Allah Ta'ala created us to be. You know, He didn't create us as human beings to be angels or jinn or whatever, birds. You know, He wanted us to be human beings. And, you know, there's a part of us that has to go down so that we can go up. And the more that we can go down in some way, the more nutrients, you know, the metaphor of the tree, the bigger the roots of the tree, the larger it can grow. And so there's this somatic and the semantic. You know, the parable is of a goodly word, the tree. The goodly word is the semantic, kind of the, you know, the prefrontal cortex, the aql, the higher faculties of man. It's like a goodly tree. أصلها ثابت. Its foundation, its root is established, and its branches reach up. فرعها في السماء. And so we need to be able to do that. And actually, it's really beautiful if you find a seedling. If you look at a seedling, you know, when it first germinates, it germinates down. The first thing to grow from a seed is the root. It's not the shoot or the branch or the flower.
It goes down first.
It's the root first. It shoots down and it spreads. It begins to fractalize, and then as that gains some, you know, becomes thabit. Now you have this upward ascent, this upward extension, which was what we see as beautiful flowers, and, you know, the honeys there and collect the nectar and make beautiful food out of it. But that's all kind of a byproduct. It's all secondary and contingent on this capacity for that seedling to germinate and go down first, which is what, you know, oftentimes, I know you often use this term as well, this idea of the shadow. This part of us that's like beneath the surface, not evil, not bad, but just part of us that's maybe we're not shining the lightness of the light of witnessing, the light of awareness onto. And so it's this kind of latent, you know, factor of our personality, of our being, that's informing so much of who we are, but yet we don't understand it, we don't see it. And Jung has an amazing quote about this. He says, you must make the unconscious conscious. Otherwise, it will drive your life, and you'll call it fate.
Yeah.
People say, this is who I am. I'm a horrible person. I'm not worthy of love. I'm not worthy of this. And this is part of your shadow, and that comes from somewhere. And if you can begin to understand that and bring awareness to that and bring compassion to that, and really begin to process whatever is there to be processed around that work, you'll begin to really bring that shadow piece into the heart, and it'll be nourishment for the heart, and it'll be that nourishment from the roots that can help you extend upwards to the heavens, inshallah. I really believe that. I see that all the time.
Sounds like a good place to stop.
Okay, we'll end it there, inshallah ta'ala. I hope that was useful for everybody, and inshallah we'll keep this up. I think next one.
Yeah, next one I'd really like to explore is hawa and shahwa and shaitan and dunya.
Beautiful. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the four frame it.
I'd say the four elements within the nafs or outside of the nafs, two are external, the dunya and the shaitan, and the hawa and the shahwa being within, that can, you know, almost knock the nafs off if we don't have a sense of awareness of these things and a sense of mastery of how to interact with these things.
Nice. Great. Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa salam. You take care, guys.
Take care, son.